Welcome to Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is all about the chemistry of life, or in other words, the common chemistry behind biology. At its most fundamental level, life is made up of matter. What is matter? Matter is any substance that occupies space and has mass. It's made up of elements and their compounds. What's an element? Elements are unique forms of matter with specific chemical and physical properties that cannot break down into smaller substances by ordinary chemical reactions. There are 118 elements, but only 98 occur naturally. The remaining elements are unstable and require scientists to synthesize them in laboratories. Now, the smallest unit of matter that still retains all of the element's chemical properties is known as the atom. An atom cannot be broken down into anything smaller and still retain all of the same properties of that element. So, for example, one gold atom has all of the same properties that a gold coin does. The gold coin is just a very large number of gold atoms that have been molded into the shape of a coin. Now, two or more of the same type of atoms chemically bonded together is a molecule. And a compound is a substance consisting of two or more different types of elements in a fixed ratio. Now, the characteristics of a compound can be drastically different from those of the elements. Take, for example, sodium and chlorine. Whenever you add those together, you get sodium chloride, which is salt, which is essential for life. However, sodium alone explodes in water, and chlorine alone is a poisonous gas. Take a look at this video that demonstrates what sodium does in water. Now, there are a ton of cool videos if you just feel like cruising the internet and looking at sodium being thrown into water. Some of them can get pretty big. Now, the way we visualize elements is by using a table called the periodic table, which organizes and displays different types of elements according to their properties. Each column in the periodic table is called a group. The elements in each group have the same number of electrons in the outer orbital, or in other words, they have the same number of valence electrons. So if we take a look at group 1, every element in this group has one valence electron. Every element in this group has two valence electrons. These here in the middle don't necessarily follow that rule, but you can pick back up over here with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. You will also find this zigzag line on periodic tables. To the left of the line indicates that these elements are metals. To the right of the line indicates that these elements are nonmetals. The periodic table may also be color-coded. For example, here we have metals labeled as a yellow, metalloids labeled as red, and nonmetals labeled as green. Within the periodic table, each element will have its own square. On most periodic tables, within the square, you will find the name of the element, a symbol for the element, you'll find the atomic number, and the atomic mass. Out of the 92 naturally occurring elements, only about 25 of them are essential to life. 4 elements are common to all living organisms, And those 4 elements also make up the greatest percentage of elements in living organisms. For example, oxygen composes 65% of the elements found in a human body. In the non-living world, elements are found in different proportions, and some elements common to living organisms are relatively rare on the Earth as a whole. For example, the atmosphere is rich in nitrogen and oxygen, but it contains very little carbon and hydrogen. While the Earth's crust, although it does contain oxygen and a small amount of hydrogen, has very little nitrogen and carbon. In spite of their differences in abundance, all elements and the chemical reactions between them obey the same chemical and physical laws, regardless of whether they are part of the living or non-living world. One atom of each element is composed of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Now, protons and neutrons weigh approximately the same. However, their charge is different. A proton is positively charged, whereas a neutron is uncharged. Electrons, on the other hand, have a negative charge. They represent the same negative charge that the atom's proton charge has, typically. Electrons are much smaller in mass than protons. Therefore, they do not contribute much to the element's overall atomic mass. Now, an element's properties depend heavily upon the structure of its atoms. The weight and overall charge of an atom can change drastically by adding or removing protons, neutrons, and electrons. Each atom is composed of a centralized nucleus containing protons and neutrons. Now, orbiting that nucleus are the atom's electrons. And the more electrons you have, the overall greater negative charge the atom will have. The more protons you add, the heavier the atom will be, and the greater the positive charge it will be. Now we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at nuclear symbols. So each of those little squares I pointed out on the periodic table is called a nuclear symbol. Each nuclear symbol represents a particular atom of an element. It'll give the mass number in the upper left-hand corner and the atomic number in the lower left-hand corner. Now, the mass number is the number of protons and neutrons together. The atomic number for each element is specific to that element. All atoms of the same element share that same specific atomic number. An atom's atomic mass is equal to the number of protons and neutrons within the atom. However, the number of neutrons within an atom is variable, resulting in isotopes. Isotopes are different forms of the same atom that vary only in the number of neutrons that they possess. So it changes the mass to have a different number of neutrons. So because of this, the atomic mass is the calculated mean of the mass number for all of the naturally occurring isotopes. So let's say we want to calculate the charge for a particular atom. Well, we can look at its nuclear symbol. We know this bottom left number is the atomic number, which is equal to the number of protons. So we have 8 protons. And our mass number is 16. Well, mass number is protons plus neutrons, so we know we have 8 neutrons. Without otherwise being indicated of a charge, we know that we have the same number of electrons that we do protons. So the answer to this one is 888. Now this next problem We know that our atomic number represents protons, so we have 15 protons. And 31 is our mass number, so we have 16 neutrons. We still haven't been indicated about a charge, so we'll assume that it's the same as protons. So we have 15 electrons. So our number is 15, 16, 15. I'll give you just a few seconds to look at this one and make sure you know what's going on, and then I'll give you the answers. Okay, so we know we have 30 protons down here in this bottom left, and our mass number is 65. So that means we have 35 neutrons and still 30 electrons because we haven't been indicated otherwise. Now, I mentioned something called an isotope earlier. Isotopes are different forms of an element that have the same number of protons but a different number of neutrons. So let's take a look at hydrogen and a couple of different hydrogen isotopes. Now, this first example on the left is hydrogen 1. Hydrogen is a special element. In its neutral form, it does not have a neutron. There is only one electron and one proton. So you probably won't find atomic hydrogens floating around. They want to combine with other elements to fill their outer shell and become stable. Now, this middle atom is hydrogen 2. Hydrogen 2 does have a neutron, bringing its mass number from 1 to 2. Hydrogen 3 has 2 neutrons, and that's represented by the picture on the right. With 2 neutrons and 1 proton, its mass number has risen to 3. Here's another example of an isotope. On the left of the image, we see carbon in its neutral form, where it has 6 neutrons, 6 protons, and 6 electrons. As we move to the right, we gain neutrons. However, the electron configuration does not actually change. It's just the nucleus that continues to grow as you add neutrons. Now, we tend to represent electrons on the outside of the nucleus within this nice little circle. However, that's just one way that we represent where we think electrons probably are. Now, this common model was developed by a Danish scientist in 1913. It shows the atom is a centralized nucleus containing the protons and neutrons, with the electrons in circular orbitals at specific distances from the nucleus. Each energy level can house different numbers of electrons. In energy level 1, represented by N1, you may have 2 electrons. In energy level 2, or N2, you can have 8 electrons. In 3, 18 electrons. In 4, 32 electrons, and so on. While it is impossible to calculate exactly where an electron's location is, we do know that it is most probably located within its orbital path. Shown here is a more modern understanding of where electron orbitals are. Each atom will have electrons housed within shells. Shells are the area in which an electron is limited to. Within each shell will be subshells. Some shells may have one subshell, and some may have multiple subshells. Subshell S can house 2 electrons. P can house 6 electrons. D can house 10 electrons, and F can house 14 electrons. Each of these has a different shape, as indicated by this image. Within each subshell, there are different electron orbitals. And electron orbitals are the space that the electron is most likely to be in. Some subshells will only have one orbital, whereas some subshells will have multiple orbitals. Take a look at this video. It will show you how these shells and subshells come together and where exactly these electrons are at within the orbitals. So the way we represent how these electrons fall within their electron orbitals is called an electron configuration. Down here at the bottom, you can see what we call an electron configuration chart. It shows how these electrons fall into these shells and subshells. So when you're filling these shells with electrons, they stack. And by that I mean you fill up your first principal shell and its subshells. Then you move to the next principal shell, fill up its subshells. Then you move to the next principal shell and fill up its subshells. So if you make it to principal shell number 3, you will have 3 S subshells. So for example, if we had an atom that had 10 electrons, you would fill up both of your first 2 principal shells, because you would start at principal shell number 1, put 2 electrons in its S subshell, and then you would move on to principal shell number 2. You would fill up its S subshell first with 2 electrons, and then you would fill up the P subshell, which holds 6, to give you a total of your 10 electrons. Down here at the bottom of the screen shows how you would write out your electron configuration. The number indicates which principal shell you're in, and the lowercase letter represents what subshell of that principal shell you're filling. These superscript letters represent the number of electrons, so if you were to add all of those up, you know how many electrons you have. So in this case, we have 16 electrons, and we have filled all of the first 2 principal shells, and we've filled subshell S of principal shell 3 and have 4 electrons in our principal shell 3p. This periodic table is pretty neat because it shows how electron configurations fall within the table. So you start up here in the upper left-hand corner with hydrogen, which has 1 electron with the 1s shell. And then you move down 1s, 2s, 2p, 1s, 2s, 2p, 3s, and so on. So we've kind of hinted at this, but why are electrons so important in determining how an atom acts? Well, it's because of its valence electrons primarily. The valence electrons are the electrons in the outermost shell. These electrons have the highest energy and are the ones involved with chemical bonding. Now, the rows on the periodic table are called periods. Periods indicate the number of the outermost shell containing electrons. So these numbers down here indicate the outermost shell containing electrons. And again, the groups across the top tell you the number of valence electrons available. Now remember, the number of valence electrons that an atom has depends on how reactive that atom is. An atom that has a full outer valence shell is less reactive than one that does not have a full outer shell. The octet rule means that in the process of bonding, atoms will tend to act in a way so that they can achieve a more stable state. And what this means is that they try to act like the nearest noble gas to them. They will try to get the same number of electrons that the noble gas closest to them on the periodic table has. The noble gases are this column or group on the far right. They all have a full valence shell. They're all non-reactive, meaning they are very stable. They can also be called inert gases. Chemical reactions occur when two or more atoms bond together to form molecules, or when bonded atoms break apart. The substances that we use at the beginning of a chemical reaction are called reactants. They're usually represented on the left side of a chemical equation. The substances that we're left with at the end of a chemical reaction are called the products, and they're usually represented on the right side of a chemical equation. Some reactions are irreversible, so a unidirectional arrow is drawn. However, some reactions are reversible, meaning that they can go in either direction. So these are indicated by an arrow that heads both directions. Equations in this state can travel back and forth until a certain relative balance between reactants and products occur, which we would call equilibrium. However, biological reactions rarely obtain equilibrium because the concentration of the reactants or products or both are constantly changing, often with one reaction's product becoming a reactant for another reaction. Now, ions are atoms or molecules that have a net electric charge, either positive or negative, due to the loss or gain of one or more electrons. So a cation is something that loses an electron and thereby ends up more positive. So it's a positive ion. An anion is something that gains an electron, so it becomes more negative. It's a negative ion. So when we want to try to figure out the net charge for an ion, we go about it in a similar way to how we would do it for a neutral atom. So our bottom left number over here shows the atomic number, meaning we have 12 protons. Our top left number shows our mass number, so protons plus neutrons. So we have 12 neutrons. But over here, it shows that we have a +2 charge, meaning that we have lost 2 electrons. So since we lost 2 electrons, we would have 10 electrons left. So let's take a look at these examples. We would have 30 protons, 35 neutrons, and since we have a +2 charge, that means we've lost electrons, so we would have 28 electrons left. For this example, we would have 7 protons. Since we have 14 mass number, we would have 7 neutrons. But we have a -3 charge, meaning we have gained an extra 3 electrons. So we would have 10 electrons. Now, ion formation adheres to the octet rule as well. Metallic elements will tend to form positively charged ions, or cations. These metals will tend to lose all of their valence electrons to obtain the stability of the nearest noble gas. Now, nonmetallic elements tend to do exactly the opposite. Nonmetals will gain electrons so that they can have the same number of electrons as their nearest noble gas, meaning they tend to form anions, or negatively charged ions. Now, when an ionic bond occurs, atoms transfer or move electrons from one atom to the next to obtain an optimal stable state. This movement of electrons is called an electron transfer. Take a look at this image down here on the left. We have 2 ions, a positive ion and a negative ion. A transfer of electrons occurs, and the positive ion gives up its electron to give the negative ion 2 electrons and fill its valence shell. Now with covalent bonding, atoms share a pair of valence electrons between the 2 atoms. These are really strong bonds, and they're much more common than ionic bonds in living organisms. So down here, you can see how the image is a little bit different. Instead of transferring an electron to another atom, these 2 atoms share the electrons. Go ahead and take a quick look at this video. It does a great job of showing where the electrons are and how they're moving whenever these bonds occur. So now we know that when we're talking about covalent bonds, these atoms that are bonding are sharing the electrons. Well, in some of these situations, the atoms may share the electrons equally, which is called a nonpolar covalent bond. In other situations, one atom will have a more electronegative charge than the other atom, which leads to a bond that the atoms do not share the electrons equally. This is referred to as a polar covalent bond. Electronegativity is an atom's attraction for the electrons within the covalent bond. An unequal distribution between these atoms allows for a more slightly positive or a slightly negative charge to develop. The more electronegative an atom is, the stronger it pulls other shared electrons towards itself. The periodic table also shows trend lines for electronegativity. As you increase down the groups, your electronegativity will increase. As you decrease down the periods, your electronegativity will increase. Not all bonds are ionic or covalent bonds. Weaker bonds can also form between molecules. 2 weak bonds that occur frequently are hydrogen bonds and van der Waals interactions. Without these 2 types of bonds, life as we know it would not exist. When polar covalent bonds containing hydrogen form, the hydrogen in that bond has a slightly positive charge because hydrogen's electron is pulled more strongly toward the other element and away from the hydrogen. Because the hydrogen is slightly positive, it will be attracted to neighboring negative charges. When this happens, a weak interaction occurs between the slightly positive hydrogen and the slightly negative oxygen. This type of interaction is called a hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds are common and occur regularly between water molecules. Individual hydrogen bonds are weak and easily broken. However, they can occur in very large numbers in water and in organic polymers, which creates a major force in combination. Hydrogen bonds are also responsible for zipping together DNA double helixes. Like hydrogen bonds, van der Waals interactions are weak attractions or interactions between molecules. Van der Waals attractions can occur between any 2 or more molecules and are dependent on slight fluctuations of electron densities, which are not always symmetrical around an atom. For these attractions to happen, the molecules need to move very close to one another. These type of bonds contribute to the protein's 3-dimensional structure in our cells that is necessary for their proper function. Take a look at this video to understand more about van der Waals interactions. Now we're going to talk about one of the most important molecules on the planet, water. Water is very special for many reasons, and we're going to go over some of those properties and why it is so important to life. So something that's unique about water is that its solid form is less dense than its liquid form. This is because of hydrogen bonding. When water temperature is reduced and water freezes, the water molecules form a crystalline structure that's maintained by hydrogen bonding. As water molecules freeze, they push further apart, which creates a latticework structure. This structure is what allows ice to be less dense than water. The right portion of this slide shows how the interaction between water molecules change as the temperature changes. Up here we see a gaseous state, and down here we see a frozen solid state. Now, why is this important? The fact that water is less dense than its liquid form is extremely important if you were to be an organism that lives within a lake or a pond. Because you see, if the whole chunk of water froze instead of having ice floating on top, everything in the pond would die. Because ice floats on top of the pond, it allows for many organisms to exist below the insulated layer of ice. Because water is a polar molecule with a slightly positive and slightly negative charge, ions and polar molecules can be readily dissolved in it. This is what we would refer to as a solvent. A solvent is a substance capable of dissolving other polar molecules in ionic compounds. Now, a hydrophilic substance is something that interacts with water well. It's another polar substance that interacts with or dissolves in water. Hydro means water and philic means loving, hydrophilic. A hydrophobic substance is a substance that is nonpolar and does not dissolve or interact readily with water. Examples of this would be like a fat or an oil. Another unique quality of water is that it has a very high specific heat capacity. It actually has the highest specific heat capacity of any other liquid. Specific heat is defined as the amount of heat 1 gram of a substance must absorb or lose to change its temperature by 1 degree Celsius. For water, this amount is 1 calorie. It therefore takes water a long time to heat and a long time to cool. The specific heat capacity of water is about 5 times higher than that of sand, which explains why land cools so much faster than the sea. Water also has a high heat of vaporization. Heat of vaporization is the amount of energy required to change 1 gram of a liquid substance to a gas. For water, this is 586 calories. As liquid water heats up, hydrogen bonding makes it difficult to separate the liquid water molecules from each other, which is required for it to enter its gaseous phase. As a result, water acts as a heat sink or a heat reservoir and requires much more heat to boil than does a liquid such as ethanol, whose hydrogen bonding with other ethanol molecules is weaker than water's hydrogen bonding. Eventually, as water reaches its boiling point of 100 degrees Celsius, the heat is able to break the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules, and the kinetic energy between the water molecules allows them to escape from the liquid to a gas. Even when below its boiling point, water's individual molecules acquire enough energy from other water molecules, such as surface water molecules. Even when below its boiling point, water's individual molecules acquire enough energy from other water molecules such that some surface water molecules can escape and vaporize. This is what we call evaporation. Evaporation is essential to life for many purposes, including cooling the environment and cooling our bodies. As water evaporates, energy is taken up by the process, which then cools the environment where the evaporation is taking place. Have you ever wondered why beads of water tend to stick together, like a bubble on a surface? Or perhaps why beads of water stick to your car windshield and don't just run straight down? Well, the reason for this is that water has cohesive and adhesive properties. At the liquid-gas interface, water molecules cling together. This is because water molecules are attracted to one another because of hydrogen bonding. This is what we call cohesion. Water molecules on the surface of a body of water or a glass of water that have no neighboring atoms above exhibit a stronger attractive force upon their nearest neighbor. This is what we call surface tension. It allows for the surface of the water to withstand pressure or stress. So again, this slide just shows how hydrogen bonding arranges these molecules, and why cohesion exists is because of these hydrogen bonds. Water's cohesive properties are related to that of its adhesive properties as well. Adhesion is the attraction between water molecules and other molecules. This attraction is sometimes stronger than water's cohesive forces, especially when the water is exposed to charged surfaces, such as those on the inside of a thin glass tube known as a capillary tube. In this image, we can observe that water is climbing up the capillary tube that's been placed within inside the glass. Notice that the water appears to be higher on the tube's side than in the middle. This is because the water molecules are attracted to the capillary's charged glass walls more than they are to each other, and therefore they adhere to it. This type of adhesion is called capillary action. Capillary action is the method in which trees transport water from their roots to the tops of the trees and their leaves. These forces pull water up the column. This pull results from the tendency of water molecules evaporating on the plant's surface to stay connected to the water molecules below them. And so they are pulling them along. Water's cohesive and adhesive properties are what allow this water strutter to stay afloat. Now, water is also an excellent buffer. What do we mean by a buffer? A buffer is a substance that readily absorbs or resists changes to excess hydrogen or hydroxide ions. As humans, the majority of our body is made up of water, which is critical in maintaining our pH. So what exactly is pH? The pH scale is a scale from 0 to 14 that measures the amount of hydrogen ions in a solution. For a substance to be acidic, it means that the hydrogen ions would increase in concentration within a solution. For a substance to be alkaline or basic, the substance would decrease in hydrogen ion concentration. Neutral on the pH scale is a 7. Anything below a 7 is considered acidic. Anything above a 7 is considered basic or alkaline. Check out this video to understand a little bit more about how blood pH works. And then also check out this neat video on the properties of water. So you may have heard that living things are carbon-based. Life as we know it is carbon-based. It's hard for us to even contemplate a life form that is not based upon carbon. Carbon is an extremely versatile element. The basic structure of carbon allows it to be the backbone for many different macromolecules. This is because it can form covalent bonds to as many as 4 different atoms, because it needs 4 electrons to fill its outermost shell. Hydrocarbons are organic molecules consisting entirely of carbon and hydrogen. Hydrocarbons are often used in our daily lives as fuels, like propane for your gas grill or butane for your lighter. The many covalent bonds that occur between the atoms in hydrocarbons store a great amount of energy, which releases when these molecules burn. Methane is the simplest hydrocarbon molecule. It has a central carbon atom bonded to 4 different hydrogen atoms. The shape of its electron orbitals determines the shape of the methane molecule's geometry, where the atoms reside in 3 dimensions. The carbons in the 4 hydrogen atoms form a tetrahedron with 4 triangular faces. For this reason, we describe methane as having a tetrahedral geometry. As the backbone of many macromolecules in living things, hydrocarbons can exist in long linear carbon chains, as well as branch chains and multi-membered rings. The individual carbon-to-carbon bonds may be single, double, or triple covalent bonds. Each of these types of bonds affects the molecule's geometry in a specific way. Their 3-dimensional shape is critical to how they function. Isomers are molecules that have the same number and type of atoms, but they're arranged differently. Structural isomers are isomers that have different covalent arrangement of atoms. So, we still see that we have 4 carbons in both of these examples. However, the structure is very different. So that makes it a structural isomer. Now, if we look at B, we have geometric isomers. Geometric isomers have a different arrangement of the atoms around a double bond. So we still have the double bond in both of these examples, but a different arrangement of atoms. We have 2 hydrogens up here and hydrogens in different locations on the next example. C shows enantiomers. Enantiomers are non-superimposable mirror images of each other, meaning they are the same, but they're mirrored. So structurally, they're different. Now we're going to briefly go over some of the common biological functional groups. Functional groups are groups of atoms that occur within molecules and confer specific chemical properties to those molecules. We find them along the carbon backbone of macromolecules. Chains or rings of carbon atoms, with those occasionally substituted with another element such as nitrogen or oxygen, form this carbon backbone. Each of the 4 types of macromolecules, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids, has its own characteristic set of functional groups that contribute greatly to its differing chemical properties and its function in living organisms. So, as I mentioned, the most important functional groups in biological molecules include the hydroxyl, methyl, carbonyl, carboxyl, amino, phosphate, and sulfhydryl groups. The hydroxyl group contains a carbon or an R group that is attached to an oxygen and a hydrogen. They are polar hydrophilic substances that tend to make things more soluble in water. They are hugely abundant in sugars and alcohols. The carbonyl group will have a carbon double bonded to an oxygen atom that is also bonded to 2 independent R groups. Carbonyls are polar, and they are typically found at the site of enzymatic bond breaking or making. Every sugar will have a carbonyl group. Now, the carboxyl group will have a carbon atom that is single bonded to oxygen and hydrogen. It'll also be single bonded to an R group and double bonded to an oxygen. Carboxyl groups are acidic and they're negatively charged. They're often found in amino acids, fatty acids, acetic acids, and other types of acids. The amino group is characterized by an R group bonded to nitrogen and two hydrogens. Aminos are alkaline and they are positively charged. They often serve as a biological base maintaining 3D structure of large molecules. They are typically found in amino acid neurotransmitters and bases of nucleic acids. The sulfhydryl group, also called thiols, will have an R group bonded to sulfur and hydrogen. These molecules are polar and typically form disulfide bonds. Now the phosphate group has a little bit more of a complex structure. It'll have a phosphorus atom double bound to an oxygen. The phosphorus atom will also be bonded to two oxygen ions, slightly negative ions. And then it will also be bound to an oxygen that is attached to an R group. These molecules will be acidic, they will be negatively charged, and hydrophilic. They're often involved in the regulation of energy within a cell. They're common in phospholipids and NTP. This video does a really great job of summing up the biological functional groups, so go ahead and check that out. And after you finish that, you will have finished Chapter 2. Have a great day.